Welcome to the Earth stage. My name is Meryl Feather. You are joining us for the Storytelling for Climate panel. If you are looking for the Building for Resilience panel, it is back on the Give First stage. So head on over there in the left rail. Either session will be awesome. We're glad to have you. We are going to get started right away. We'll tell you guys a little bit more about our backgrounds in just a second. We're all from marketing and communications backgrounds, and excited to have this discussion with you all. I'm going to start by kicking it over to Kristen to give us some initial thoughts. This panel is about storytelling, right? So to give us some initial thoughts on what a story is. What is a story? What are we even talking about here? And I'm just going to acknowledge, I know we're having some technical difficulties with Chris, who's dealing with some audio issues. So bear with us, folks, as we try to work through that stuff. But Kristen, why don't you give us a start?
Yeah, so I had some really great Family Feud slides prepped for this until someone told me there was no slides. But I'm going to start really quickly just with kind of what a story isn't. And these are things that we each come across quite a bit when we talk to founders and early stage teams, really trying to figure out how do they talk to people about maybe a crazy innovation that they're working on, or trying to get people excited about a business that is infrastructure related. Like how do they find the story in that? And so common things that people often mistake for being like the story are your product. And so actually your product really isn't the focus of your story. It's definitely an important part of your story, but your product alone is not the story. People often think maybe a lead investor is a story. It's definitely not also a story. Your lead investor is really great and powerful social proof, so a great endorsement of your company's quality and ambition and vision, but not the central focus of the story. In the climate and sustainability space, a lot of people orient their marketing and communications around their gigaton removal, but that also is not a story. What really is a story at the end of the day is identifying the human wants and needs. So really thinking about the context in which your product activates, or the people you reach, or the change you're creating, but identifying and tying that to people's needs or wants. So you're really trying to figure out, what is that promise or that state change that you're creating, which really gets us into why vision matters and why telling a story that ladders up to a vision matters. And so I'll stop the monologue in a second, but really, like, why are stories even important? So stories, are really how people create meaning and convey understanding. It's really a leverage point that can help people have more memory about your product and more instantly place you in the context of their lives. And it's also a way that people create trust and connection. So stories, while they might seem fluffy at times, they are really important when you're looking to connect people to the technology and solutions that you're creating.
Yeah, and I think there's a great stat that we had pulled earlier about just how memorable stories are, that they're 22% more memorable than, 22 times more memorable than just facts alone. So as marketers and communication professionals, and we can kind of transition to telling a little bit more about us, but we really think about that power of story in the business context, in the context of how to use the power of story to grow and build businesses. So I'll do a little intro on myself and my background related to story, and then pass it over to Kristen. My experience is in brand management and product marketing. I've led teams and worked in those specific areas at Facebook, Hasbro Toys, and tech startups. And I have really seen the power of storytelling come to life in not just engagement programs, marketing programs that help really draw audiences to you, build growth and build engagement, kind of targeting those specific behaviors you may be looking to drive with your business, but also the power of story to draw talent to a team and draw talent to an organization, and to help an organization that's growing rapidly to stay on strategy, right? To be able to move together faster because of a cohesive narrative and a clear narrative that everybody can rally behind and understand. And now today, Kristen and I have a consultancy together called The Regenerates, where we focus on storytelling for climate and sustainability solutions specifically. So Kristen, I'll pass it back to you to say a little more about your background.
Yeah, and hopefully we get Chris back here too. So
I know.
One of the reasons we were super excited about this panel too is the three of us, we all transact in story in our day-to-day, but we do it from very different lenses. So like Meryl shared, she does it primarily from the marketing lens. Chris, if he's able to join us, is much more on the PR and media relations lens. And then my background is very much in branding communication strategy. So my version of story and the way that I use stories, same stories, is a little different, where I'm always looking to figure out how you can create the right sentiment and the right feeling about a company, how you can create connections, kind of foster trust, how you kind of build more movements broadly. Upon coming into the climate space, I've actually learned that brand strategy is a lot like community organizing. So it's a very similar toolkit. And so my background, I worked across a variety of companies, mostly all in tech and consumer, from helping launch Google Fiber in Kansas City to building multi-touch point and multi-device experiences for Hyundai. I was in-house at Airbnb for some time, and then I kind of struck out on my own to consult with more deep tech and kind of more technical products. So the way that I really think about story is like as if it's an immersive play that's like happening over time, where your audience is a participant, your product is a participant, and really what is this thing that we're trying to create together. So a little different than the way that Meryl and Chris work with it, but.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have different backgrounds, and hopefully Chris gets up here to share his as well. In the meantime, the other thing Chris and I wanted to talk about was just reflecting on some of the common challenges or pitfalls that we see across the companies that we work with as they are thinking about their story, some of which are particular to the climate and sustainability space, and some are more generalized and broadly applicable. And so we thought to kind of talk to a handful of those and kind of how what we see and what we tend to work through in order to kind of get to the other side of them. And the first one is really around this concept of the impact that the organization wants to have, and almost focusing too much on the impact, or over-orienting or overselling the impact. And I think when we were brainstorming around this, we see a lot of language from startups in this space around things like save the planet, or I'm going to solve climate change. And of course, we all know that those are the big ambitions we all want to contribute to. And the question is really, how do you tell the story of your contribution to those bigger, lofty goals in a way that feels credible and tangible to the people who are, considering participating with you or activating with you? And I'm curious too, Kristen, if you have anything you want to add there to my description.
Yeah, I think one of the observations I've had is sometimes it's really hard to know who you're talking to, which is often why folks default to somewhat generic terms or somewhat generic vision statements like that. And so I think really the more you can get really crisp and really get to know not only, who's your buyer or who says yes to your technology, but the way in which it affects other stakeholders, you can get to a much clearer, crisper, more motivating message. Because oftentimes, you don't want to over-explain the product, because a lot of these solutions are somewhat technical, and that tends to confuse people if they're not really like in it. So just kind of, it's always a struggle to figure out at what altitude do you share the climate and sustainability message, who is the audience that you're really speaking to at each phase of that, and realizing too that you're not saying the same thing to all people at all the time.
And I think you just brought up this element of kind of like, at what altitude are you speaking? I think there's also a lens here of kind of with what complexity, right? And kind of with how technical are you getting? The sort of, it seems like the extremes might be, here's this higher level general message about saving the world or solving climate change. And then as you want to get more specific, it's easy to get very complex very quickly. Obviously, we know how complex the climate crisis and solving it actually is. But in order to really bring people along and bring them into your organization, you have to find the right balance so that the complexity is not overwhelming and it's true to your product, of course, and it's technically accurate. But that may not always mean that you have to explain every piece of what your product does or every detail. And so I think that's something that I think about certainly is kind of finding that right balance. Because simpler language doesn't have to mean it's dumbed down. It can be it can be an invitation really for more people to participate.
And I think a lot of that is very similar. A lot of that happens because we know that early stage startups typically tend to rely on a certain number of channels or toolkit to tell their story. So a lot of PR, a lot of media relations. And so those moments when someone else is telling your story, it can feel really necessary, or you're using only one channel to tell your story. It can feel really necessary to say everything at once and get everything in there, or say the biggest, broadest thing possible. And so I like to always encourage folks to build a channel strategy, to understand of the various avenues and means and mediums that you have available, segment it for your audience. So you might be speaking to a much more technical audience in some instances. You might be speaking to a much more broader general audience in others, and then tailoring the message to that accordingly. And that kind of brings me to one of my other favorite points, because I think that message targeting can be really confusing for people, because we're always told, repetition, consistency, all of those things. And then now I'm telling you, don't say the same thing to everyone all of the time. So how do you keep it straight? And this is an area where I think that big, bold vision really comes into play. So really painting the context of what is this world that you're creating. It's a little like sci-fi, like world creation is a huge element of sci-fi. And the more visceral you can get about it, the more you can make people feel. And that feeling is really what you want to attach to, because at the end of the day, what your product does might pivot at some point. Who your immediate audience is that has to say yes will pivot and change. But when we talk about brand, that's why we talk about creating that feeling and really building in toward that vision. So all of these other things can kind of change below. So that's always, I like to separate and divorce those two things and just point out that they have very, very different roles. And oftentimes, I do see in a lot of climate communications and storytelling that, we focus a lot on this, the do or like what to think aspects of communications, but not so much the feel. And actually like the way that people operate, the way that they make decisions is feel, think, then do. And so I like to just remind everyone to bring in the feels.
That's a great point. We had a comment. I'm just getting to the chat to give it a quick glance, and I see that Jim has mentioned empathy, which I think is a really good point, that empathy is key. And I think that is a way to also think about the feel component, right? Is kind of what are your stakeholders, what are your customers feeling, what are they dealing with, and how can you build empathy with them? Oh my goodness, Chris, can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes!
And now it's like the last 5 minutes, but I'm going to say something really impactful.
Chris is about to rock our world. Well, do you want to, we were just going through some of the challenges and pitfalls, but why don't you give this audience a quick introduction of your experience and how you work with story?
Yeah, for sure. So sorry, everyone, for the technical challenges. Totally my fault, not Techstars. My name is Chris Alieri. I live in Brooklyn, New York. For the last 4.5 years, I've had a public relations and communications firm entirely focused on startups working in climate tech. So I've worked with over 4 dozen companies. I've got a team of folks in New York and California. And we've helped a lot of companies that are in the late seed stage to the early Series A to Series B really communicate their stories and go out to investors and media in compelling ways.
Very cool. So we were just talking a bit about some of the common challenges that come up in, narrative around climate and sustainability stories. I was just getting ready to transition us to a different one. So this is a perfect segue, which is this concept of that comes up. This one's a bit more general, but the concept of storytelling from your competitors and kind of paying attention, to your competitors in a way that can almost be distracting. And so I think that was something this team wanted to think about too, is what do we do when, what do you as a startup do when your competitors start squawking loudly about what they do and you're sort of reflecting on what does this mean for me?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like the inspirational side poster on the wall, which is like your only competitor is yourself, right? But it is kind of true. And I think I've worked with too many companies and if any of them are listening, it's not you. I'm not talking about you. But if there's too many companies that are focused almost as if like two bad kids or the other kid got away with it, but we didn't, right? And sometimes I think there's that combination of marketing language and over positioning of scaling and all of that with the actual data, and we've had impact, and we've shown scalability, we've shown commercial success, all of that. So I think that oftentimes we get caught up with what the competitors have maybe gotten away with in terms of overly hyping their companies, but just because they're doing it, it doesn't mean you need to copy it. But if they are doing some of it, maybe they're right? So maybe there is something to hyping a bit more than maybe you're comfortable with. So I think it's about, having these internal conversations, obviously partnering with people like Meryl and Kristen, but, helping people sort of define your story. But the way you do that is by just being a student of your industry. Read everything possible that's out there. Track your competitors, follow them on social, look at them on LinkedIn, look at everything they're saying, right? So there's really no excuse in this day and age to put out something that's a replication of what someone else has said, right? Because we know pretty much what everyone is saying all the time.
Mm-hmm. And I love the invitation. I feel like the competitive stories are they're an invitation for you to double down on what makes you different, what makes you really unique. And sometimes that takes, a bit of finessing, a bit of self-reflection, a bit of that really deep industry study to really suss out and crystallize. And so I think, to the extent that you can kind of see that competitive as more like a challenge to yourself to double down on your own story, I think that's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the other piece that we were going to talk about was about letting others dictate your story. And I think this is probably something that comes up in PR a lot too, right? Of just kind of what's that balance between telling your own story in your own voice versus balancing with channels where somebody else is going to interpret and tell your story. Curious if either of you have thoughts on that.
Kristen?
Yeah, I kind of touched on this before, just, recommending that folks invest in more than PR. Sorry, Chris. But, the more channels you have to tell your story, the more opportunities you have to repeat your story, the more opportunities you have to connect with an audience in a targeted way, the more that uniqueness is going to come through and the more it's going to land. And so, in certain instances, big broad media makes sense. But it shouldn't be the only way that you're telling your story, because that's how you get to those very vague things that happen, or a lack of ownership.
Right. That's a great point. And I'm the first to say that, PR should not be your only piece of ammunition, right? You really don't forget your own channels. Don't forget, your own website, your own social, your own LinkedIn, right? You can control the narrative. I think too oftentimes we're so focused on what TechCrunch is going to say about us, but we've forgotten that what we put out on our website or our blog, there's a resurgence of blogs, for good or for bad, right? A lot of people are blogging again, right? So corporate blogs, the good, bad, and indifferent, that's probably a whole nother session. But I think in regard to, don't forget, the narrative that you can control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that Meryl and I usually talk about with folks, because they're like, great, I have to blog now. I have to do that on top of everything else. Like, how do I keep up with that? Is don't feel pressured to do it consistently. Like, definitely rotate on quality. And, if you put out a banger report once a year and you really program around that piece of content, you have a panel, you have a conversation, that's enough. And you can really build a lot of equity into that one thing that you do really, really well. So don't feel like you have to spend your entire day on Twitter.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. You're talking about activating around the content, and just to like double click on that for a minute, that is, like Kristen's saying, it's almost like using a marquee piece of content as a platform for getting your story into other channels or out through other mediums.
Yeah, and I think that, maybe we're not to predictions yet, but I think one of the things that we're going to see maybe more in the future, I think there's going to be a resurgence of in-person events. I don't think that they're going to be the CES's, South by Southwest, the enormous events of years past. They're not going to be the same format, right? We're going to have more opportunity to connect with people in real, authentic, and in-person ways. So I think oftentimes, we're so used to focusing our storytelling on like the formal episodes, the formal interviews, whether it's an interview with a reporter or an investor or an analyst or a potential customer. But really, any opportunity to talk about your company is an opportunity for you to test it out and change and adjust and really, like kind of that constant drumbeat of the same story that you keep telling. And I think that sometimes people feel like they need to reinvent every time to be interesting. But actually, there's an element of storytelling that is pretty rote and pretty repetitive, right? And that's how you get people to remember.
And two, I think never underestimating that your people, your team, your customers, they're all people who can tell your story for you too. And that is the great thing about events, is you actually gather and convene a group of people who, they can share a tweet from your event. They can write about it. They can talk to a friend about it later, which is the other reason that not getting so in the weeds on all the facts and figures, and really trying to elevate your narrative to that vision, that context, that really human aspect of what you do makes a lot of sense. Because I always like to use the cocktail party analogy. Like, you're not going to walk up to someone and just start spewing facts at them, right? Like, you're going to get to know them. You're going to find out what they are interested in, and then kind of tie if you want to be an engaging conversationalist, you really tie what you're doing to their context. And so I always like to use the cocktail party rule. So when we can go to those again.
Well, guys, we are coming up on time. So I'm going to have us do one quick round robin question before we wrap this up, which is about what story do you want to hear more about, or do you think would have an outsized impact in this space that you're not hearing about right now?
Well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think that you guys have probably gotten into some of the specifics already, but in terms of, we have a lot of stories that are super focused on consumers, right? A lot of stories of like, we're helping consumers like recycle their sneakers and we're going to reuse everything, right? And like there's a lot of focus on that, right? And I think that we have to look at the bigger climate issues, and I think that some of them are not what we're putting into the air. I mean, there's so much focus on carbonization and decarbonization, right? But I think that in terms of plastic, big plastic, I want to see more stories about that, how people are getting rid of that problem. Sorry, we're down to a few seconds.
I know, Kristen.
Meryl, you have a great answer, so I want to let you.
Mine is about jobs, really, and I would love to see more people telling the story about how we're going to help bring along the folks who are in the fossil fuel industry today and help them be part of the transition. Because I just think that that's I have a lot of empathy for folks in
Absolutely.
that space, and knowing where we want to go with the future, we have to paint a picture of the future that brings everybody along. Yep.
Yeah. And then mine is, you know, recognizing that climate change, I like to talk about the fact, like, climate change is a massive trend. Like, it is not something that is just about the weather. It's about the way that we see ourselves connected to each other, the way that we understand our interactions in the world. And so I think thinking about it much more in this huge societal shift in the way that we live, that we view life, that we view all of these things, and trying to narrate that into that more, because I think that that's a really juicy exploration that's not happening enough.
Great.
Awesome. Well, I wish we could chat longer. I hope those attending enjoyed the conversation. We're going to wrap up. If you guys have a few minutes before the next main discussion starts, so head on over, if you haven't yet, to the Startup Expo. There are some demo videos from amazing companies. Nori is one of our featured startups right now. You can go check out their demo video about their carbon removal marketplace. And then you'll meet the team back at the Give First stage for some announcements in just a few minutes. So thank you all for joining us and being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.